All right, we're looking at Galatians, and when we ended, we were looking at chapter 5, verses 2 to 6. And here Paul warns the Galatians about the grave danger of seeking justification under the Mosaic law. And he tells them that if they accept the Judaizers' heresy by submitting to circumcision, that Christ will not benefit them. See, in that case, they will be choosing to relate to God under the old, obsolete Mosaic covenant instead of relating to God through Christ and the new covenant. And he explains in verse 3 that by submitting to the Mosaic law, again, represented by their submitting and agreeing to be circumcised, they assume the obligation to obey all the commands of the law. That if that's how you want to play, that's where you want to go, you want to seek your relationship with God under this obsolete covenant, well, then your only choice, you're obligated to obey all the commands of the law. And as he said in chapter 3, verse 10, this puts them under a curse because no fallen humans continue to do all the commandments all the time. So they're under a curse, and when that's combined with the alienation from grace that's inherent in their alienation from Christ when they choose to relate to God under the old obsolete covenant, well, then there's no remedy for that curse. Right? So then they're in big trouble. And so that's what he's telling them. He says it's Paul and the adherents of his gospel. Right? It's the adherents of his gospel who, through the Spirit received by faith, they eagerly await the hope of righteousness. They eagerly await the blessings that are in store for the righteous. It's not the Judaizers and their followers who eagerly await the hope of righteousness. For the truth of the matter is that in Christ, the distinction between the circumcised and the uncircumcised, the distinction between Jew and Gentile is no longer relevant. See, what matters is faith in Christ. And anticipating the coming discussion, he indicates that the faith of which he speaks is not what we would call, quote, faith only. You see, the faith of which Paul speaks there, it's not mere mental assent, simply believing that things are true. It is a trusting allegiance. That's what biblical faith is. It's a faith that manifests itself in love for others. There cannot be biblical faith that doesn't play out, and that's so he's pointing to the coming discussion. He says means anything. Rather, what matters is faith working through love. You see, it is active. Then he says in 7 to 12, he says, "You are running well. Who hindered you from following the truth? This persuasion is not from the one who calls you. A little yeast leavens the whole lump of dough. I am confident about you in the Lord that you will think no other way. But the one who's confusing you will bear the judgment, whoever he may be. And I, brothers, if I'm still preaching circumcision, why then am I still being persecuted? In that case, the stumbling block of the cross has been abolished. I wish that those who are troubling you also would emasculate themselves." Now, Paul here is, Paul's speaking strongly. So by means, in the first verse in 7, by means of a rhetorical question, Paul indicates that the Judaizers, they are actually hindering the Galatians' pursuit of the truth. And he adds that this type of persuasion doesn't come from God. You see, he says, who hindered you from following? This persuasion is not from the one who calls you. God has called the Galatians through Paul. That's not where this is coming from. And in saying that, he denies the Judaizers' claim to divine backing. Every heretic comes in and says, listen, I'm the guy who really knows. I'm the guy who has the deep insight. And so Paul says, no. These people here, he says, you were running. Who hindered you? They hindered you. And this comes not from the one who called you, not from God. Whatever they may wind up trying to say. And then employing this proverbial saying of a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough, he warns them against taking the Judaizers' destructive influence lightly. You see, it just takes a little bit, though the heresy may be relatively small at this point. That may be the state of play right now, that it's just getting a foothold and it's just pulling some people in. But it may be relatively small, but it holds the potential for totally corrupting the Galatian churches, for making them unacceptable to God. And that's serious business. Right? That's why heresy has to be addressed. Heresy has to be nipped. You can't just let it go and flourish because it is corrupting and destructive. And so Paul is telling them that. He's confident that they'll agree with his assessment of the danger and that they'll give that assessment the attention it deserves. And he's also confident that the persons advocating this heresy, that they will be condemned by God. He said the same thing in chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. He's confident they'll be condemned by God. The singular, he says, the one who's confusing you. He could be referring to an individual, but that's probably a generic. It's denoting the adversaries as a whole. Okay, because in chapter 1, verse 7, he said, those confusing. So he's probably saying the one confusing, using him as a stand-in for whoever it is that's doing it. And then he says, whoever he may be. And what he's emphasizing there is that, look, God's judgment about this is it's impartial. It doesn't matter who it is who presents the heresy. As he said in chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, even if it's an angel. Right? It doesn't matter. Well, what if it was some former great? It doesn't matter. Whoever he may be who's selling this nonsense to you and endangering you with this heresy, it doesn't matter that they're going to be condemned. That's what he said, even if it be an angel. In chapter 1, they're to be cursed by God. And then as proof that he doesn't still preach circumcision, as the Judaizers had apparently slandered him and saying, it seems like what they were saying is, listen, Paul's telling you this stuff, but Paul, when he goes over somewhere else, he still talks about circumcision. You have to become a Jew. And Paul says that's absolute nonsense. He doesn't still preach circumcision. And as proof of the fact, he points to that, look, he points to the fact he's still being persecuted by those who insist on binding the Mosaic law. If I were in fact doing what they say, if I were in fact preaching the necessity of circumcision, meaning that you have to convert to Judaism to be saved, then they wouldn't be after me. They wouldn't be pursuing me if that were the case. If he preached that, they wouldn't be after him because he would have removed the stumbling block of the cross, meaning that he, like they, in that case, if he's preaching circumcision like they are, well, then in that case, both of them would be claiming that salvation was in doing the works of the law, rather than through faith in Jesus and his atoning death. Because that is in practice what they're saying. Now, whether they would acknowledge that or not, I don't know. But they are in effect saying, because they say, in the era of the new covenant, you still must become a Jew and relate to God under the Mosaic law. And Paul's point is that in saying that, they bring themselves under an obsolete covenant which has no mercy element left. Because the sacrifices of that old covenant are no longer recognized, because the Christ who underwrote all sacrifices has now appeared on the stage of history. He has become evident and has offered the true sacrifice. So ultimately what they're saying is listen, you are then depending on your own performance. That is all you are left with if you seek to relate to God under the Mosaic law in the new era. And so that is a works thing. And Paul says, so if I was doing that, what they're claiming, then I would have removed the stumbling block of the cross. That's what they're tripping over. And so he says that's just not what's happening. Now, he expresses his righteous anger toward the Judaizers by declaring his wish that they would carry their fixation with cutting flesh, right? They're all about circumcision. This is a big thing. No, you have to convert to Judaism, and the sign of this, and you're coming into being a Jew, is you have to get circumcised. So their fixation with cutting flesh, he says, I wish they would carry that fixation with cutting flesh to the extreme of castration. They're into cutting flesh. I wish they'd go all the way. Now that's strong. That's strong. We'd probably run Paul out of most churches. But Paul was willing to say that. And we dare not condemn Paul's words for his rhetoric here, right? It's judged by the Spirit of God to be helpful in impressing on the Galatians the enormity of the Judaizers' sin. This is the Spirit of God speaking. So let's be careful before we sit in judgment of the Spirit of God. Well, the Spirit, what does he know? If he'd have consulted with me, I'd have told him how he could say that smooth. This is the Spirit of God. So trust that the Spirit of God knows what's necessary, what was helpful in impressing that on him. I mean, this kind of statement, it's reminiscent of Luke's reporting of Peter's words to Simon. In Acts 8:20, Paul's words to Elymas in Acts 13:9-11. As Timothy George remarks, he says, in this emergency situation, Paul summoned the courage to utter a word of imprecation. It had to be said, and it was right for him to say it, because a lesser rebuke would have signaled an unconscionable compromise and retreat. Let no one ever utter such words lightly, unadvisedly, or in a spirit of personal aggravation and revenge. Those kinds of statements are likely to return upon the one who pronounces them with all the reciprocal force of a boomerang. Martin Luther's comment on Galatians 5:12 spoke to this issue. Now here he's quoting Luther. He says, here the question arises whether Christians are permitted to curse in this sense, not using vulgar language. He says, are permitted to curse. He says, yes, they are permitted to do so, but not always, and not just for any reason. But when things come to the point where the word is about to be cursed, or its teaching, and as a consequence, God himself blasphemed, then you must invert your sentence and say, blessed be the word and God, and cursed be anything apart from the word and from God, whether it be an apostle or an angel from heaven. And there's something here I just see about, this respect for God and his word. And so when Paul sees what's going on here, and the Spirit of God working through him says, this is an emergency situation, this is crucial, this is critical, this must be said this strongly to wake the people up and get them to see how grave the danger is. And so Paul does that, and as I say, we just have to be careful about sitting in judgment of the Spirit of God. Galatians 5:13 and 15, he says, for you were called for freedom, brothers, only do not use that freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love be slaves to one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the command, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you not be consumed by one another. They were called by God through Paul for the purpose of freedom, to be free from their prior restrictive religious requirements, from their former slavery under the elements of the world, as he said in chapter 4, verses 1-7. And as he has explained, they're having been freed from that. That's inconsistent with their returning in principle to that slavery by embracing the Judaizers' gospel. That's what he said in chapter 4, verses 8 through 11. Now here he cautions them not to use that freedom from the Mosaic law, not to use that freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, as a platform from which base impulses and desires produce sinful behaviors. Thomas Schreiner says, here the concern is that freedom may be abused and become an occasion for the selfish will to dominate. Instead, the freedom is to be used for loving service to one another. Well, what are we to do with this freedom that we've been freed from our prior restrictive religious requirements? What are we to do with that? We are to engage in loving service of one another. They're to render loving service to one another because that's how God has called His people to live. That's how God's called us to live. Render loving service to one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the command, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And as I have said many, many times, okay, the law as the complete set of commands, the unit, the package, the body of commands of the Mosaic covenant, it's no longer enforced, but the moral norms that were included among those commands, they have ongoing and even renewed applicability, and they find their full expression in the new covenant. That some commands included in the Mosaic law, that some of those commands have ongoing or renewed applicability while others don't. It's evident, for example, in a text like 1 Corinthians 7:19, where Paul says, look, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is everything. Keeping the commandments of God is everything. Clearly, the command to circumcise is not among the commands that Paul now considers important to keep, right? Because he says it's nothing. Circumcision or uncircumcision is nothing but keeping the commandments of God. So clearly circumcision isn't among the commands that Paul thinks it's still important to keep. So that's significant, right? Some of these commands, you see there's a qualitative difference here. There's a qualitative difference among the commands that were included in the Mosaic law. You have some here, like circumcision, that no longer has any relevance, no longer among the commands that you're to keep. But there are other commands that you're to keep. There are moral norms that were included in that set of things. Moral norms that were there. So some represented some of those commands. They represented the eternal moral desires of God that existed before the Mosaic law. Right? God had moral desires. They existed before the Mosaic law. They were expressed in the Mosaic law, and they continue after the obsolescence of the Mosaic law. You see, the Mosaic law is an articulation, is a statement that includes many things, but it includes the moral norms that existed before that law was given. The moral norms for which the world was judged for being wicked in the flood, long before the law. You see, that's an important thing. So I just want you to see that there's biblical basis for recognizing there is a qualitative distinction among the commands that are part of the Mosaic law. You see that reflected here. So others, like circumcision, so you have these moral norms, but you have these other things in the Mosaic law, such things as circumcision, food laws, and holy days. Those things were peculiar to Israel's specific role in God's unfolding plan of redemption. So he has eternal moral desires that predate the Mosaic law, that are incorporated into the Mosaic law with a lot of other things that are peculiar to Israel. And then you have these eternal moral things that carry on after the obsolescence of the Mosaic law. All right, that doesn't mean that the Mosaic law is still in effect. The fundamental ethical requirement of the Christian, as I've said ad nauseum, is what? It's love. That is the center of Christian ethics. That is the bullseye of Christian ethics. But, you see, some conduct is loving and some is not. We think that when you say that the center of Christian ethics is love, that we now move into the world of subjectivity, and it's all, well, I think that's loving. That's loving. This was loving. We were in love, so I wanted to shack up. We were in love. This is loving. That's not what it's about. There's objective content to love. Love is an umbrella commandment under which there are particulars, under which there are specifics. And you see that in Romans here. In Romans, the classic example is in Romans 13, 8 through 10. You see that some specific conduct is loving and other conduct is not. Love is the center, but there are definite requirements on how love expresses itself. Paul says in Romans 13:9, the command to love your neighbor as yourself encompasses the commands of the law. Okay, well, what's the center? The bullseye, this umbrella commandment is love. But that encompasses commands of the law that relate to interpersonal action, right? It encompasses the commands of the law not to commit adultery, not to murder, not to steal, not to covet. And he adds, he says, in other commands that he doesn't specify. Do you see, they're summed up in this overarching command of love. So it's not this amorphous, subjective thing, so that somebody can say, yes, I'm committing adultery, but I'm doing it in love. No, you're not. Well, that's your opinion. No, that's Bible. You see, that's Bible. So the Christian, though not being under the Mosaic law, not being under the set, the body, the package, the unit, not being under the set of commands that are part of the Mosaic covenant, upholds the transcendent moral requirements that predated the Mosaic law but were included in that law. We do that. It's this ongoing moral law centered in love that is the law of Christ. What Paul refers to in 1 Corinthians 9:21. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ. Under the law of Christ. That's what he's referring to. Now, so Paul and other inspired writers, they can cite commands from the Mosaic law as something Christians are obligated to obey. The whole point of Paul saying is, look, the Mosaic covenant is obsolete, right? Yet you will see that they can go back and cite commands from the Old Testament. The classic example is Ephesians 6, right? Ephesians 6:2. Paul commands children in 6:2 to honor your father and mother, quoting directly from the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20:12 and Deuteronomy 5:16. Now the Ten Commandments, they're also reflected in New Testament commands and prohibitions against idolatry, the swearing of oaths, murder, adultery, stealing, slandering, lying, coveting. Indeed, there are literally hundreds of commands in the New Testament issued by Spirit-inspired writers, many of which commands are rooted in the Old Testament. Okay? Many of them are rooted there. Now, an important thing to note about this, okay? What I want you to see, or one of the things I want you to see is that commands in the Mosaic law, like, for instance, Ephesians, when he goes back here and he cites about honoring your parents. The commands in the Mosaic law, they're not applicable as Mosaic law. They are not applicable as Mosaic law. That is by virtue of their being in the Mosaic law. That is not the source of their authoritativeness because the Mosaic law is part of an obsolete covenant. That's not the source of their authoritativeness. Rather, they're applicable because they are universal moral desires of God that were included in the Mosaic law, and because those eternal desires were articulated, were expressed by God for the people of Israel in the Mosaic law, one can cite that particular articulation of God's universal moral desires as a Christian requirement. Right? Because here are these moral norms that exist before the giving of the law. They are included among the commands of the law, and they are expressed there. The law is rendered obsolete. Moral norms carry on. So I can go back to God's articulation of the moral norms for the people of Israel and cite that, not because it's Mosaic law, but because the Mosaic law included divine expressions of the eternal moral norms. Does that make sense? Okay, it's important because I think there's so much confusion. And people, you have some people saying you just need to throw the Old Testament in the trash. You got people like the Judaizers saying, no, you got to convert to Judaism. And there's a spectrum there of all kinds of things. But here you see this idea. It means, look, the Mosaic law, you have those articulations. They can be cited as these divine moral desires that preceded their embodiment in the Mosaic law, and they continue after that law was rendered inoperative. All right, so if instead of using their freedom to render loving service to one another, if instead of doing that they use it, so they've been freed from their restrictive religious requirements, and if instead of using that freedom to serve one another in love, they misuse it to attack one another, which may have been occurring, you see, in the wake of the agitating Judaizers. Isn't that what happens when something drops into a community of believers and somebody starts selling something, and now there's agitation and there's all kinds of conflict because these people are saying, no, this is what you need to do. This is what's right. This is what's right. You're not saved. You have to come over here and become a Jew. And you have some people there undoubtedly going, that's crazy. I don't think that's right. Paul never said that. Now what happens? The pot boils. Okay, it creates dissension, and it creates difficulty in the community. And so Paul here, he says, look, if instead of serving one another in love, if they attack one another, which may have been something that has been increased by the presence of these agitating Judaizers, they run the risk of spiritually destroying one another. Do you see? I mean, if the community of faith, if it devolves, if the church devolves into a war zone of anger, dissension, and hostility, the faith of brothers and sisters in Christ becomes a casualty. That's what he means when he sits here and says, look, you will be consumed by one another. That's what happens. It becomes a casualty. They are destroyed spiritually when that happens to a community of people. So it can never happen. Cannot let that happen. Then Paul says in 16 to 18, so I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will in no way carry out the desires of the flesh. For the flesh desires things contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit desires things contrary to the flesh, for these are opposed to each other, so that you may not do whatever you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now, the key to avoiding the kind of sinful, spiritually destructive behavior that Paul has just been talking about is to be walking by the Spirit, to be living in a way determined by the Spirit of God. As Moose says, who directs and empowers Christian living. See, if they continue to do that, if they continue to walk by the Spirit, then they will not carry out the desires of the flesh, because the desires of the flesh and the desires of the Spirit are what? Opposed to each other. So if you are yielding to the Spirit and walking by the Spirit, you won't carry out the desires he's warning them against, because those two things are opposed to each other. So yielding to the empowering Spirit means that they will be victorious over the impulses of the flesh. They will not live according to those things because they are opposed to each other. And if you will yield to the power of the Spirit in your life, you will stop resisting. You will become completely pliable for the Spirit to transform you into the image of Jesus. Then you will not be doing its opposite. You will not be doing the things that I've just warned you about. Now, the Judaizers, they probably claimed that immoral living was the only alternative to submitting to the Mosaic law. You see, they probably said, the way they probably framed this was, listen, if you reject the need to relate to God under the Mosaic law, the only alternative is lawlessness, immorality. You see, and God, you know God can't have anything to... So that was how they framed it, probably. Is that, listen, if you reject the need for the Mosaic law, then what you're essentially saying, the only alternative is that, immoral living. But Paul says that's a false dilemma. That's a false dilemma. You see, moral living doesn't require the applicability of that set of laws. Moral living doesn't require the applicability of the Mosaic law. Indeed, the power of the Spirit, who's freely available by faith in the new covenant, enhances moral living. Enhances living the way God intends his people to live. Paul's gospel is not a gospel of moral license. It is not a gospel of moral license. It is not a gospel that rejects moral obligations and duties. That is not the gospel of Christ. Paul's gospel is not that way. He adds at the end of verse 17 that this fundamental opposition of spirit and flesh means that they're not two equivalent paths. Okay, they're not two equivalent paths that leave Christians free to do whatever they want in terms of which one to pursue. It's not tit for tat. It's not 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It doesn't matter which of these two courses I choose. No, they're in fact opposed to each other. They're opposed to each other, and that means that one is the right way and the other is not. And Christians are obligated to yield to the Spirit. They are obligated to take that path instead of its opposite. And he adds that the choice to walk by the Spirit, to be led by the Spirit, that's available only to those who are not under the Mosaic law. You see, it's available only to those, not the Judaizers. That choice is only available to those who are not under the Mosaic law. He says, but if you're led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. You're not under the law. See, the converse implication being that if you're under the law, you're not led by the Spirit. If you're led by the Spirit, you're not over here in this column where these guys are trying to drag you. If you're over here in this column, well, then you're not led by the Spirit. You see, that's what Paul is talking about. As I've said, he's seeking in the era, and I've repeated this morning, when you're seeking in the era of the new covenant, when you're seeking there to relate to God under the old covenant, that's to resort to the flesh. That's to resort to the flesh in the sense that it leaves you standing before God on the basis of human effort, on the basis of human performance, because all that is left in this old covenant is the bare commandments that you then must fulfill. You have to continue to do all the things in the law because the mercy elements of sacrifice aren't recognized. So that's your choice, and so basically you're being pulled over to not by the Spirit, but by human performance in the flesh. Those are the alternatives. So Paul, he indicates here that doing so leaves one without the Spirit. I mean, that's consistent with what he said elsewhere, right? His earlier indications that the Judaizers are damned. Right? They're damned. So this is perfectly consistent with that. They have no relationship with God. That's what it means to be damned. They have no relationship with God, and they thus do not have the Spirit whose presence is a hallmark of that relationship. Okay, so they are over here without the Spirit, slugging it out, doomed to failure, doomed to damnation, no relationship with God. Whereas the Christian walks by the Spirit, is empowered by the Spirit to do the things that God wants done. And he says here in 19 to 21, now the works of the flesh are obvious. The works of the flesh are obvious, which are sexual immorality, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, hostilities, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambitions, dissensions, factions, outbreaks of envy, instances of drunkenness, acts of revelry, and such things as these. I tell you these things beforehand, even as I previously told you, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Those who practice such things, he's writing to the Christians in Galatia. Those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Paul declares that the actions of the flesh, those deeds that are opposed to the Spirit, they are obvious. Thomas Schreiner remarks, and I don't know why I didn't make a slide for this, he says, those things that issue from the flesh are obvious and clear to anyone with an ounce of discernment. You see, they're a matter of common human knowledge. They're a matter of common human knowledge, part of the law of the heart that's tied to mankind being made in the image of God. As I explained earlier, and I said again this morning, mankind was guilty of sin before the giving of the Mosaic law. It was guilty of sin before the Mosaic law, and that guilt before it was given, and that was based on the innate or intuitive knowledge of core moral principles and additional moral principles that followed from that core, that derived from that core. The flood of Noah's day and the culpability of Gentiles after the giving of the Mosaic law. That testifies to the fact that they were under moral obligations despite not having a law, despite not having a body of express commandments. Paul says in Romans 2:14 and 15, for whenever Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things of the law, those not having the law are a law to themselves. They show the work of the law written in their hearts, as their conscience and commonly held thoughts also testify. So the Mosaic law, it's not necessary. Paul says, he says the acts of the sinful nature, they're obvious. It's not necessary. The Mosaic law is not necessary to know core moral principles and their derivatives. Don't you think that people in pagan worlds had laws against murder? Sure they did. Paul will even sometimes appeal. He'll even say, this is stuff that even pagans understand. Well, how do they understand that? They didn't have the law. They understood it because it's part of what it means to be a human being. It's part of what it means to be a human being. Now, we can seek to suppress those principles, those core moral principles and their derivatives. We can seek to suppress those things and refuse to acknowledge them. But as the philosopher J. Bujashevsky says, and he and others have argued, we cannot not know core moral principles. We cannot not know core moral principles. Now, against the modern claim that the knowledge of these core moral principles, and therefore their derivatives, but that these core moral principles have been, knowledge of them has been obliterated so that we truly are ignorant of right and wrong, and we're blamelessly doing our best. We're just out here adrift. What do we know? We can't know anything. We don't know, and we're really doing our best to try to find it. Well, against that claim, people like Budziszewski, they say, all this sounds persuasive, yet it's precisely what the older tradition, the natural law tradition, denies. We do know better. We're not doing the best we can. The problem of moral decline is volitional, not cognitive. It has little to do with knowledge. By and large, we do know right from wrong, but wish we didn't. We only make believe we're searching for the truth so that we can do wrong, condone wrong, or suppress our remorse for having done wrong in the past. If the traditional view is true, then our decline is owed not to moral ignorance, but to moral suppression. We aren't untutored, but in denial. We don't lack moral knowledge. We hold it down. Okay? And now that, to me, you see, that resonates with the human modus operandi that I see described in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and 19. For the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who what? Who suppress the truth. Who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what is knowable of God is evident among them, for God displayed it to them. Now, as a reminder of what works of the flesh look like, Paul says it's obvious, right? But as a reminder of what works of the flesh, what that looks like, he gives them some examples of things that are contrary to the desires of God's Spirit and thus have no place in the life of a Christian. No place. You don't get to, sometimes you hear people, well, I'm free from the law. I just do whatever I want. And so that they think that's what the law means. They think that I'm free from moral requirements. And I tell people, I said, how can you read the Bible and think that? What do you do with all of these statements that you need to do this and do that? Well, that's all law. You're hung up on law. No, I'm hung up on trying to understand what God is saying. And I'm trying to integrate it and understand it. And so you see these things. So he sits here and he says, look, Paul here, he gives these examples. These things are sinful. These ideas. He reminds them of what these works of flesh are. Engaging in these things is wrong. Engaging in these things is sinful, despite the fact that Christians are not under the Mosaic law. We're not under the Mosaic law, but that doesn't mean these things aren't wrong and sinful. They're illustrative and not exhaustive, and that's clear from, he says, and such things as these. So he gives them an illustration just to show them the types of things as a reminder of things that are obvious. And I heard that second bell, and Lord willing, we'll carry on next week. Thanks.